I gave them 15 years. 15 years of strategy decks at 3 a.m., of weekends lost to product launches, of red-eye flights, last-minute presentations, emergency pivots, and holding the company together when half the leadership was still out of office. I was there before the logo redesign, before the rebranding, before the investment round that took us from a cramped industrial loft to a sleek glass tower in the heart of the city. Back then, we were 7 people sharing one bathroom and microwave ramen. Now, 300 employees, 2 international offices, and quarterly bonuses that could fund a small town. And through all of it, I stayed. I never missed a deadline. I never complained about the politics. I never let the cracks show. To them, I was dependable, calm, calculated. The senior strategy director who never needed supervision because she was the structure. But loyalty in corporate America is a one-way mirror. You give and give until there's nothing left. And when they're done with you, the light shifts. You look up, and the reflection staring back isn't yours anymore. It's theirs. Younger, cheaper, hungrier, easier to mold. I knew it was coming 6 months before it happened. Not because someone warned me, but because I'd learned to read the subtle shifts, the way meetings moved to rooms I wasn't invited to, the way ideas I'd seeded weeks earlier returned with someone else's name on them, the way my direct reports started glancing nervously when I walked by their desks. Then came the ultimate sign. They hired a new chief transformation officer, a vague, loaded title that almost always means one thing: layoffs are coming, and someone needs to hold the axe with a smile. They introduced him during the quarterly town hall. Mid-40s, MBA pedigree, smile like a razor, said he was here to optimize our operational direction and empower agility. Translation: he was here to trim fat. I was the highest paid female executive at the company. I wasn't fat. I was leverage, and they were about to cut me loose. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd seen the writing on the wall before they'd even finished drafting the script. Because while they were plotting my exit, I was already 5 steps ahead. They had no idea I'd already built my contingency, and it was weaponized. The real pivot began on a rainy Thursday in November. That's when I started making copies, not out of paranoia, out of pattern recognition. 15 years in the same chair teaches you one thing above all else: nothing in a company happens suddenly. Not product failures, not mergers, and definitely not terminations. Everything leaves a digital fingerprint before it becomes a headline. Every betrayal breathes long before it strikes. I noticed the calendar shift first. My weekly meeting with the CEO, Lucas, quietly vanished from my schedule. No message, no explanation. Then the financial controller stopped CCing me on budget approvals I used to review. Then a mid-level manager I mentored suddenly bypassed me on a strategic recommendation and sent it directly to the C-suite for efficiency. These weren't accidents. They were rehearsals. So I rehearsed too. I began forwarding key documents to a private, secure drive I controlled. Not confidential data, but emails that mattered. Memos I authored that were now being edited by others. Forecasting models I built that were suddenly repackaged under someone else's name. Screenshots. Hand-stamped, organized, quietly, efficiently. They thought I was slow to adapt. They didn't realize I was archiving my vindication. By the time their so-called transformation officer, Jeremy, the man with the $500 sneakers and a habit of calling women kiddo, scheduled a casual coffee with me in conference room 7B, I already knew he was the one sent to drop the axe. He opened with compliments. Of course. Ava, you've been with the company since the beginning. You're a pillar. I nodded politely, mentally reciting the checklist. Flatter her, reassure her, deliver the bullet under soft lighting. Sure enough, he eased into it. But we're shifting into a new era of agility, and we need people who are ready to evolve rapidly. Your skill set is incredibly respected, but perhaps not fully aligned with where we're heading. Translation? We were too experienced, too expensive, too female, too threatening. He offered a smile like he was doing me a favor. Of course, we'd love to make this as smooth as possible. Severance, transitional support, glowing recommendation, all the usuals. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I didn't ask why. Because I already had what I needed. Not just a trail of how they'd boxed me out, but something much bigger, what they were hiding. See, they underestimated what 15 years buys you. It doesn't just buy experience. It buys access. While they were preparing to erase me, I had quietly kept tabs on an internal compliance report that never made it to legal, one I'd been asked to ignore 8 months ago when it first surfaced. It detailed questionable payments routed through a partner shell company tied to a vendor Lucas's brother controlled. Payments labeled as expedited logistics, but totaling nearly $1.2 million over a 6-month span. Back then, I flagged it to finance. They said they'd handle it. Now, that report was in my possession, documented, dated, and attached to emails from senior executives acknowledging the irregularity and failing to act. If they wanted a quiet exit, they should have kept me closer. Because that report, paired with their pattern of marginalizing senior women and manipulating credit on core projects, told a much bigger story than just my dismissal. It told a story of rot at the top, of profit funneled quietly, of an executive team desperate to modernize their image while gutting their core integrity. So I smiled back at Jeremy, nodded once, and said, "I understand." I left the room that day with a formal dismissal agreement, a severance package they hoped would buy my silence, and a flash drive in my purse that held their future in the balance. They thought I would fade quietly, take the payout, move on like a good soldier. What they didn't realize, what none of them ever realized, was that the woman they tried to erase didn't just walk away. She walked forward, with every receipt, every connection, and a plan so complete it already had a launch date. I didn't burn their building to the ground out of rage. I let it collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. I just made sure I was standing far enough away to watch. They say revenge is best served cold, but I didn't want revenge. Not yet. What I wanted was control. Control over the narrative. Control over the outcome. Control over how, when, and who would be sitting in front of an ethics board wondering how a woman they dismiss like a disposable spreadsheet just detonated their entire executive ladder. So I began the work, not emotionally, not impulsively, strategically. The morning after my dismissal, I scheduled 3 meetings, not with friends, not with HR, with experts. First, a corporate compliance attorney, Elena Ramirez. She was quiet, sharp, and had the kind of memory that could quote a CC code verbatim. When I laid out the situation, the fired warning signs, the buried financial report, the corporate gaslighting, she didn't blink. "This isn't wrongful termination," she said. "It's willful concealment. If what you're showing me is accurate, they're not just pushing you out, they're burying you before a storm hits." "Then let's give them the storm," I replied. She smiled, not out of amusement, but out of respect. "I'll draft the first letter." Second, I reached out to a journalist. Not just any journalist. Mara Lane, a tech business columnist who'd once written a blistering exposé on executive misconduct at a fintech startup. She had a reputation for precision and burn-level storytelling. I didn't send her the full package. Not yet. Just a teaser, a redacted copy of the report, 3 internal emails that confirmed the discrepancy, and a question. "Are you interested in a story about financial fraud, executive retaliation, and the woman they tried to shut down before she exposed them?" Her reply arrived in under 2 hours. 1 word. Yes. Third, I called my mentor, Angela Dubois. She wasn't just a name in my contacts, she was the name in our industry. A retired COO, board member to 3 Fortune 500 companies, and one of the few people whose opinion could shift the temperature of an entire room. I hadn't spoken to her in a year. We weren't close, but she respected strength, and I needed her eyes on this. I laid it all out, what I'd seen, what they'd done, what I planned to do. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't flinch. "You've got a clean kill shot," she said. "Don't waste it trying to make them feel it. Just make it undeniable." I ended the call knowing exactly what the next 3 weeks would look like. Not rage, not spectacle, execution. I spent the first 7 days reviewing every shred of documentation I had and making backups of backups. Lena filed an initial complaint with the corporate ethics board, citing substantial financial discrepancies and evidence of internal retaliation. She delivered it with just enough specificity to make them nervous, but vague enough to prevent them from knowing exactly what I had. Meanwhile, I began assembling the internal timeline. Every moment they pushed me out, every project they credited to someone else, every strategic pivot they made under the illusion of modernization that was really about dilution of accountability. Then I went after their blind spots. You see, corporate predators like Lucas and Jeremy always underestimate 3 things: the junior staff they exploit, the vendors they underpay, the women they dismiss. So I reached out to all 3, privately, respectfully, without warning. A data analyst named Sam, who'd once cried in the bathroom after being publicly humiliated by Jeremy, sent me a spreadsheet that included flagged invoices I'd never seen. A woman in marketing forwarded a Slack message where Lucas referred to me as legacy baggage. A vendor rep, furious over months of delayed payments, sent me an email chain where the CFO off record admitted to manipulating contract terms mid-cycle to preserve quarterly margins. The threads were unraveling faster than I anticipated. Meanwhile, Mara, the journalist, called me with updates. "They're panicking," she said. My inquiries triggered a response from their legal team in under 6 hours. "Defensive, abrasive, due fast, Good. The more they flailed, the clearer their guilt became. But I didn't want just press. I wanted impact. So I prepared the pivot plan, my own next act. Because while they were scrambling to cover their sins, I was already building my next business, a boutique strategic consultancy focused on women-led growth firms. Something agile, powerful, built on everything I'd learned over 15 years and sharpened through the fire they threw me into. And here's the twist, I didn't fund it with severance. I funded it with the bonuses they gave me over the years, because I'd never spent them. I'd invested. I had a portfolio under a private holding LLC they didn't even know existed. While they buried themselves in margin charts and ego, I was cultivating freedom. So by the time the story dropped, front page, full feature, headline blazing, insider alleges fraud and gender retaliation at leading tech firm, I was already incorporated, staffed, branded, and ready. The same morning they tried to deny everything, my new site went live. The same week Lucas issued a limp internal apology. I signed 3 clients. And when Jeremy released a tone-deaf LinkedIn post about resilience and leadership, I quietly uploaded a webinar, viewed by over 80,000 women, titled, What to Do When They Try to Silence You. Spoiler alert, you speak louder, you stand taller, you succeed anyway. The story dropped on a Monday morning, timed perfectly to hit inboxes just as executives were arriving at their desks with fresh coffee and half-written excuses for the week ahead. I imagine Lucas sitting in his corner office, framed by glass and arrogance, reading Mara's article on his iPad, face tightening with every paragraph as his legacy collapsed in black and white. It wasn't just an expose. It was a bloodletting, shell corporations, vendor manipulation, internal retaliation against whistleblowers, discriminatory restructuring. And threaded through it all was me, not as the victim, but as the woman who saw it coming and made sure the world did too. I hadn't named names directly, but the documentation spoke louder than I ever could. Screenshots, timelines, email headers, financial statements with highlighted inconsistencies, the kind of evidence no PR team could spin. Their legal team went into overdrive. They issued a formal statement of dispute, called the article one-sided, and tried to cast me as a disgruntled former employee with a personal vendetta. But their defense was thin, predictable, male, and the timing was fatal, because Alina had already filed a formal report with the State Ethics Commission the Friday before, attaching not only Mara's findings, but a complete, confidential deposition. And not just mine, 3 others, a former financial controller, a marketing manager, and a junior analyst, all confirming pieces of the fraud I had exposed. Within 48 hours, the commission responded. An investigation was launched. Internal, external, federal. The pressure that followed wasn't just legal, it was reputational, the kind that spreads through back channels faster than press releases can clean up. Board members started to distance themselves. 3 top clients quietly suspended their contracts. A major investor demanded an emergency shareholder meeting. And me, I watched the implosion unfold like a woman sipping tea while her abuser drowns in his own lies. My inbox filled with messages, some anonymous, others not. Women from inside the company, industry peers, people who had worked with Lucas and Jeremy, and had stories that mirrored mine almost verbatim. Stories of manipulation, of gaslighting, of performance reviews that were really scripts written in rooms they were never allowed to enter. They came to me not just for validation. They came because now they knew someone wasn't afraid anymore. I became a lightning rod, not for sympathy, but for momentum. My newly launched consultancy tripled its following in a week. I hosted my first closed-door workshop for women in tech who had experienced corporate suppression. We shared strategies, names, tools. I taught them how to audit their digital trails, how to build fireproof exit plans, how to own their intellectual property before someone else claimed it with a handshake and a lie. Meanwhile, inside the company, chaos bloomed. The HR director resigned within 2 days of the article. The chief transformation officer was placed on leave pending investigation. And Lucas? He went silent. Not a tweet, not a post, just a ghost in a collapsing tower. But I wasn't done, because beneath the headlines and the noise, I had one more lever to pull, and it was personal. 2 years before my dismissal, I had been asked to serve as co-chair on the company's ethics and DEI committee. It was mostly performative, glossy brochures, polished slogans, listening sessions that never reached the leadership board. But what they forgot was that I kept the notes, the reports, the internal surveys. And most importantly, the names of employees who had reported internal misconduct and were either dismissed, demoted, or reassigned to departments they never asked to join. I compiled it all. A comprehensive timeline, pattern recognition at scale. I sent it, anonymously, of course, to 3 watchdog organizations that specialized in corporate ethics and workplace discrimination. They launched public audits. Now the story wasn't just mine, it was everyone's, and the company was no longer facing an angry former employee. They were staring down the entire landscape of professional accountability. And the irony? The people who once applauded Lucas for his visionary leadership and progressive culture now pretended they'd never known him. His LinkedIn connections started thinning. Former allies deleted public endorsements. The company's Glassdoor rating fell by 1.8 stars in less than a week. But I didn't gloat. I didn't post a single word, because the silence of a woman who no longer needs validation is louder than any victory lap. I wasn't just rebuilding my name, I was burning the old model to the ground and laying concrete for every woman who'd been told to smile through sabotage, to be grateful, to not make it personal. They had tried to erase me, but I'd left something behind, a paper trail. A movement, a warning. Dismissal was just their opening act, and I was already writing the grand finale. If conflict was about precision, then escalation was about power. The shifting of it, the claiming of it, the weaponizing of every ounce they once tried to suppress. And now, for the first time in my career, I wasn't asking permission to lead. I wasn't applying for a title. I wasn't waiting for the corner office to be handed to me after proving my worth 10 times over. I was the office. I was the title, and the only thing I was proving now was what happens when a woman they tried to bury learns how to bloom underground. By week 4 of the investigation, my name had become more than a headline. It was a whisper in boardrooms, a topic at networking dinners, a presence that hovered like an uncomfortable truth. I didn't seek it out. I didn't chase attention, but attention came anyway, not because I was loud, but because my silence made them nervous. I knew where the bodies were buried, and I knew how to build a map. The company's shareholders issued an official statement demanding a third-party forensic audit. That alone caused a drop in stock confidence. Their PR firm, the same one that had pitched their CEO as a rising ethical leader in digital innovation, dropped them by the end of the week. But what unraveled them wasn't the money. It was the pattern, because when you show the public that corruption isn't an anomaly, it's a structure, the collapse becomes inevitable. The first domino fell at a global tech conference where Lucas had been scheduled to give the keynote speech. The committee pulled him the night before. In his place, they invited a panel discussion titled Silent Exits, When Retaliation Looks Like Restructuring. I was one of the panelists. I didn't use the company's name. I didn't need to. I walked on stage in a midnight blue suit, crisp, quiet, and composed. Not a symbol of vengeance, a symbol of competence. And when I spoke not as someone who had been wronged. I spoke as someone who had endured and thrived. When women are removed from power structures under the guise of realignment, I told the audience, they don't disappear. They multiply. They become consultants, founders, speakers, leaders outside the system. Because you can silence one voice in a boardroom, but you can't mute an industry that starts listening. They gave me a standing ovation. By the end of that week, 2 other former female employees from my company filed official complaints. Class action was forming. One by one, people who'd left quietly were stepping forward, not to seek revenge, but to say, me too, me also, me again. I had become more than a name in a headline. I was a case study, and still, I stayed 5 moves ahead. My consultancy, now in its 2nd month, had signed 7 mid-size contracts, including 2 former clients of my old firm. One of those clients admitted they'd been looking to jump ship for over a year, but couldn't figure out how to navigate it without retaliation. You gave us cover, the COO told me. You burned the bridge and lit a better one. I didn't celebrate, I strategized. Because momentum wasn't enough, I wanted sustainability. So I partnered with an ethics-first investment firm and began laying groundwork for an initiative that would support women and marginalized professionals exiting toxic corporate cultures, legal education, seed funding for startups, and mental health access. We called it Phoenix Row, a name I'd chosen long ago. The night after my dismissal, when I stared at my ceiling at 3 a.m. and whispered to myself, you're going to rise from this. You're going to build something they can't burn. Phoenix Row wasn't a vanity project. It was a weapon, a rebuke, a permanent structure forged from the bones of a failed one. And word was spreading. A venture capitalist who had once ignored every one of my pitches now called asking for a meeting. We're looking to diversify our advisor portfolio, he said. You've become quite influential. I took the meeting. Then I turned him down because I didn't need their money anymore. I had value, I had vision, and I had the freedom to choose. That was the part no one prepared for. Not Lucas, not Jeremy, not the people who watched me being pushed out and stayed silent. They thought the worst thing they could do to me was strip away my title, my income, my position. They didn't realize the worst thing they could do was set me free. Now I wasn't bound by politics or policies or the need to smile through abuse. I was beholden to no one, and with every article, every panel, every new client, I was building a shadow infrastructure under the one I had once served. They still had the tower, but I had the city. And every time a brick fell from theirs, another beam was raised in mine. Because this wasn't just my escalation, it was their slow, public descent, and it was only just beginning. By month 3, the company was in free fall. What began as a murmur of misconduct had turned into a public reckoning, loud, visible, and merciless. Multiple departments were placed under internal audit. 2 of the founding partners resigned quietly under the cover of early retirement, and the interim CEO released a video message that looked like it had been recorded in a hostage room. Stiff, awkward, full of buzzwords, and absolutely devoid of accountability. I didn't have to lift a finger. The gravity of their own rot was pulling them down faster than I ever could have pushed. But I wasn't content to watch passively. Not when the system that betrayed me was still whispering its poison into the ears of women who hadn't yet realized their worth. So I expanded Phoenix Row. What began as a pilot support initiative had evolved into a full-scale network, legal resources, leadership training, and a confidential hotline for women in hostile workplaces to gather intelligence and prepare their exit strategically, not emotionally. I wasn't just helping them survive. I was showing them how to win, and word was spreading fast. My calendar filled with requests from companies who wanted me to speak to their executive teams, not about diversity for the sake of optics, but about rebuilding culture from the ground up. I wasn't interested in being anyone's moral mascot, so I set strict terms. I would speak, but only if the board was in the room, only if policies were audited, only if women on the floor got to ask questions uncensored. Half the invitations dropped off immediately. The other half doubled their offer. That was the shift. I wasn't just a former employee with a cautionary tale anymore. I had become a litmus test for corporate courage. If you weren't brave enough to stand across from me and listen, you weren't brave enough to lead. Meanwhile, the company I'd given 15 years to Voratech was hemorrhaging public trust. The external audit concluded with a 78-page report that named specific executives, highlighted financial mismanagement, and included clear evidence of discrimination in promotion and compensation structures. The findings went public within 24 hours. Media outlets circled like vultures. Innovation giant, ethical dwarf. Inside the fall of Voratech, what loyalty never bought. She built their foundation, then pulled out the cornerstone. But the most devastating piece wasn't written by Mara or any national outlet. It came from inside. One of the junior analysts, Sam, the one who once cried in a bathroom, wrote an anonymous op-ed on a tech forum titled, "The Day We Realized She Wasn't Coming Back and Why That Terrified Them." He described how my dismissal had become the cautionary tale whispered over lunch, how people had started tracking their own value quietly, saving copies of emails, documenting praise that could disappear from performance files. He said I had become a symbol of the moment every worker realizes the company doesn't love them back and decides to stop bleeding for it. That article went viral, and for the first time in Voratech's history, the company didn't respond. Not a press release, not a denial, just silence. Because what could they say? They tried to erase me. Instead, I had become impossible to ignore. At Phoenix Row, we launched our first full-scale campaign, the Exit Files. It was a public resource hub, complete with sample exit plans, financial protection guides, and a directory of vetted legal and HR consultants. Within a week, the site had over 600,000 visits. I received thousands of messages. Some were short, some were raw. "I finally resigned today. Thank you. I didn't cry in the car this morning. First time in a year. I used your strategy. My severance was tripled." They weren't thanking me. Not really. They were thanking the version of themselves they hadn't seen in years. The one who stopped apologizing for being smarter, louder, sharper, or simply tired of pretending that being valuable and being valued were the same thing. I had started a movement by accident, and now I was steering it by design. So when Voratech finally issued their last quarterly report of the fiscal year with red ink, a drop in valuation, and the quiet admission of executive restructuring due to ongoing internal challenges, I didn't gloat. I turned the page, because they were no longer the story. We were. The collective force of every woman who stayed quiet, did the work, and waited to be noticed. Now, we were noticing ourselves, and no corporate ladder built to keep us out would ever stand again. There's a kind of revenge that isn't violent, isn't loud, isn't even personal. It's structural, systemic, the kind that unseats the very foundation of power and replaces it with something unrecognizable to the people who once wielded it. That was the level I'd reached now. My vengeance had outgrown me. It wasn't about Lucas anymore. or Jeremy, or Vortex board. It wasn't about the conference rooms they locked me out of or the bonuses I was passed over for. Those were all symptoms. I was now cutting at the disease, because what they did to me wasn't a fluke. It was a blueprint, executed on thousands of women across industries, over decades. So I rewrote the blueprint. Phoenix Row moved into a permanent office space in Midtown, a glass-fronted corner unit with no hierarchy. Everyone had a voice, and every woman on my staff had lived through some version of what I had. We weren't there to grieve the past. We were there to architect the future. We established 3 divisions: triage, for women actively being pushed out or suppressed at work; strategy, for professionals rebuilding careers after corporate trauma; advance, for funding and launching female-led ventures and consultancies. Within months, we became the most feared name in silent boardrooms, not because we were aggressive, but because we knew the playbook and we taught it better than the men who wrote it. But my revenge wasn't just reactive, it was creative. So I did something no one expected. I launched the watch list. It was a quiet, legally vetted, peer-driven database, compiled through verified submissions, blind reviews, and publicly available records. It named companies, departments, even individual execs with repeated patterns of gender retaliation, discriminatory layoffs, or hidden misconduct. We didn't publish it publicly. We sent it directly to recruiters through private partnerships with the firms that mattered. The result: executives once hailed as visionaries began getting quietly removed from hiring pipelines. Search committees flagged candidates. Reference calls got shorter. Candidates who used to walk into jobs now faced questions they couldn't answer. We weren't canceling people. We were correcting the ecosystem they once corrupted. Meanwhile, I began receiving speaking requests from places I never thought would reach out: government agencies, business schools, investment firms looking to clean house. Most of them had been complicit before. They hadn't changed because they were moral. They changed because they were afraid. Afraid of being named. Afraid of losing talent. Afraid that women like me had learned how to document, mobilize, and defend ourselves in real time. I said no to most of them, but I said yes to one. A tech investment fund with a $600M portfolio, the same one that once backed Vortex expansion. They wanted me to consult on restructuring their due diligence protocol. They wanted to know how to prevent another incident. And so, on a mild Wednesday morning in April, I walked back into a world that once closed its doors to me. Only now, I owned the key. I sat across the table from a row of pale, anxious-looking executives. The man across from me, a silver-haired partner in a $1,000 suit, cleared his throat and said, "We've been doing things a certain way for a long time, but we recognize now we didn't see what we should have seen. Help us see it differently." And in that moment, I understood the true scale of my revenge. They weren't just acknowledging the past. They were paying me to build the future. The next day, I submitted a full ethics compliance overhaul proposal. 25 pages, non-negotiable terms, required board signatures, a clear outline of who they'd never fund again. They accepted without a single revision, because women like me no longer had to ask. We set the terms. And every time another firm signed on, every time a woman walked into her workplace with a contract she now understood, every time a whistleblower held her ground without being forced into silence, that was revenge. Not bitter, not broken, but permanent. This wasn't a comeback story anymore. This was infrastructure. The day I saw Lucas again was one of those moments that crystallize in your memory before they even finish happening, sharp around the edges, timeless in its weight, and utterly detached from the person you used to be. It wasn't planned. Not exactly. But nothing this precise ever really is by accident. It was a corporate leadership summit in New York. One of those glossy, invite-only events where the drinks are overpriced, the suits are tailored to intimidation, and every handshake is a transaction. I was there as a keynote speaker, not a panelist, not a side-stage motivational voice. I opened the summit, my name printed in bold across the welcome banners, my face in the event app, my session booked at capacity 2 weeks before registration closed. And that morning, while I was being wired for sound, sipping lemon water behind the stage curtain, I felt it, the slight tightening of energy in the air. Not nerves, not fear, recognition. He was there. I didn't have to look. I knew. Some men carry their guilt like a shadow. It arrives before they do. And when I stepped onto that stage, the applause was immediate, full-bodied, respectful. These weren't students or activists. These were CEOs, founders, directors, the same types of people who had once looked past me like I was part of the carpet. Now they were leaning in, listening, taking notes. I opened with a line I'd rehearsed exactly once. I spent 15 years building someone else's future, until I realized my blueprint was better than their building. The room shifted, shoulders straightened, ends clicked, and I laid it all out. Not my story, not my pain, my framework. I showed them how trust collapses, how patterns of suppression lead to executive rot, how cultures unravel from within long before HR ever hears a word. I didn't mention Voratek by name, but I didn't need to. Lucas sat in the third row, right side, between two forgettable men in identical watches. He looked smaller, not just older, diminished, like someone who'd once stood on a cliff and was now unsure of the ground beneath his feet. He didn't make eye contact once. Not during my talk, not during the Q&A, not during the break that followed, when people gathered to thank me, ask for insights, or hand me their cards like they were holding out hope. But he waited, at the edge of the crowd, quiet, hesitant. I saw him standing there, fingers twitching around a coffee cup like he wasn't sure whether to stay or run. When the last attendee drifted away, he stepped forward. "Ava," he said, just my name, not a greeting. Not a question, a plea in disguise. I raised one eyebrow. I didn't smile. I never got to explain. He began, voice quieter than I remembered. The restructuring, it wasn't personal. I stopped him with a glance. "Lucas," I said evenly, "you don't get to narrate the story you tried to end without me." His mouth opened slightly, then closed. "I know what you did," I continued. "I know what you covered, what you approved, what you ignored when it was easier to protect the narrative than the people. You built a system that rewarded silence, punished integrity, and decorated it with buzzwords." He looked around, as if someone might come to save him. I leaned in, just enough so only he could hear. "And now I'm the system." He tried to say something, I don't know what. I didn't wait to hear, because I had a second keynote to prepare, because I had a woman waiting backstage, a former Voratek analyst now launching her own tech consultancy, because I had a life so far removed from the one they tried to bury me in, it felt almost laughable that I ever thought they held power over me. They never did. I handed that power to them. And then I took it back, piece by piece, deal by deal, brick by brick. Lucas faded into the crowd, a ghost of a man who once thought he could rewrite my ending. But I was the author now, and I was just getting started. It's a strange feeling, waking up one morning and realizing there's no more enemy to outmaneuver, no fire to put out, no battle left to fight. The noise is gone. The adrenaline fades. There's just you, standing in the silence of your own victory, not breathless from the climb, but grounded, clear, free. That's where I was now. I had crossed the invisible threshold from resistance into authority, from surviving their world to creating my own. And the most surreal part? It didn't feel triumphant. It felt natural, like I had always been meant to get here, and they'd just been the detour, not the destination. My mornings began slowly now. Not with 6 a.m. alarms and inboxes full of urgency, but with deep, steady quiet. A second-floor brownstone walk-up I bought in my name, no mortgage, no shared lease, no hidden strings. Sunlight poured through tall windows and painted gold across hardwood floors. The walls were lined with art I'd chosen, not because it was fashionable or professional, but because it made me feel like I belonged to myself. Phoenix Row was thriving, not in the performative, investor-chasing way that my former world glorified, but with deliberate, sustainable force. We had expanded into 2 new states, hired 15 staff, all former corporate survivors, created legal partnerships with firms that had once ignored us, and were now reshaping policies across half a dozen mid-size firms because of our frameworks. We weren't building a brand. We were shifting the ecosystem. Our client base had grown from desperate individuals to entire departments, C-level women, even men quietly reaching out asking, "Can you help me make it right from the inside?" And I did, when I believed they meant it. Because I wasn't here to destroy for destruction's sake. I was here to make it impossible for anyone to build what hurt me ever again. The watch list expanded. So did our anonymous reporting network. We launched a certification system, verified safe employer, backed by data, policy audits, and employee testimonials. Companies that passed got a badge. Those that didn't, they stayed unlisted and quietly watched their best talent leave without warning, without drama, without return. My old mentors now called me for advice. Industry reporters now asked me for quotes. And investors? They waited on my due diligence. But even with all of that, the power, the reach, the name, the real victory was smaller, quieter. It was the 28-year-old client who walked into my office, eyes wide, posture hesitant, and left 6 months later as a founder with seed capital and a business plan she could defend in any room. It was the woman who told me, after her first public keynote, "I used to think I had to wear armor every day. You showed me how to lead without bleeding for it." It was the moment I passed by the building where I once worked, that glistening glass tower that once made my stomach twist with dread, and felt nothing. Not rage, not grief, not fear, just release. They were still in there, the few who hadn't been swept out by scandal or shame, still trying to rebuild a ship from the deck up. But they didn't matter anymore. I didn't need their apology, their acknowledgement, their regret, because I had built something bigger than vengeance. I had built wholeness, and in doing so, I'd found a kind of power they'd never be able to understand, because it didn't come from conquering others. It came from no longer needing to. There's a version of yourself that only emerges after the war is over, not the version that marched through fire, clenched her teeth through humiliation, or crafted strategy while bleeding behind closed doors. No, this version she arrives after. She doesn't wear armor, she doesn't flinch, she doesn't perform, she just is. And that's who I had finally become. I didn't check over my shoulder anymore. I didn't brace for the floor to fall from beneath me. I no longer filtered my voice through layers of palatability or sat through boardroom meetings where my ideas were translated into male applause. I spoke, and the room leaned in, because I had nothing left to prove and everything left to offer. My world no longer revolved around the corporate sun. I was my own gravity now. Phoenix Row wasn't just a success, it was a lighthouse, an institution, a name passed from woman to woman in hushed tones, in coffee shops, in networking events, in late-night DMs that began with, "I saw your story and thought maybe you'd understand." And I always did. We didn't just change careers. We changed language. We taught women to walk into negotiations armed with data, to refuse burnout as proof of loyalty, to recognize manipulation disguised as mentorship. We designed workshops that didn't just teach strategy, they dismantled shame. We celebrated exits like promotions. We mourned dreams that weren't ours to carry anymore, and planted new ones that were. Every contract we signed, every program we launched, every policy we influenced, it all added to the quiet revolution already happening across the country. Companies were updating their retention strategies, not because they'd suddenly grown a conscience, but because we made it too costly not to change. And still, the greatest victories weren't found in headlines or financials. They came in quiet Sunday mornings like this one. Me, curled up on a weathered armchair, windows open, coffee cooling slowly in my hand. The city was just beginning to stir. No emails, no back-to-back meetings, no tightrope of expectations strung across my chest. Just stillness, breath, peace earned and peace kept. I thought of the woman I used to be, how she used to tie her worth to calendar invites and office praise, how she asked for fairness like it was a favor, how she begged herself to be small enough to stay safe. She died the moment they told her she was no longer useful, and in her place I had risen. Not like a phoenix. That metaphor was too dramatic, too fiery. I rose like a woman who finally remembered she had legs. One step, then another, until one day, I didn't walk back into the places that broke me. I built new rooms, unlocked new doors, created new rules. And now I am the threshold. Women cross into my space and become more than they thought possible. They write resignation letters without fear. They turn trauma into clarity. They stop waiting for justice and start engineering their own outcomes. As for Voratech, the company never truly recovered. Their valuation plummeted. 3 board members resigned. The name itself became tarnished, unhireable for some, cautionary for others. Eventually, they were acquired by a larger firm that stripped the brand, fired the remaining execs, and gutted the leadership hierarchy. No apology ever came. And I never needed one, because the woman who once would have waited for closure now understood something deeper. Sometimes the cleanest form of justice is becoming untouchable. So here I am, untouchable, unbothered, but not unreachable. My phone buzzes with a text from a young consultant I mentored last year. Just got promoted. They tried to sideline me. I used your steps. Didn't blink. Thank you. I smile, not because I saved her, but because she learned to save herself. That's what I gave them. Not revenge, not rescue. Blueprints. And when the history of our labor is written, when they finally tell the truth about how corporate culture evolved, about who tore down the gates and built something better behind them, they'll mention my name, not as the woman they tried to erase, but as the one who rewrote the ending.